Now, I was asked and I was charged to discuss a regulator's perspective with regard to a development program that could generate data suitable for both marketing authorization and health technology assessment. So that's what I'm basically talking about in the next 20 minutes or so. And I think such a discussion is very complementary to what we have just heard from the two previous speakers. You will find a lot of similarities, but maybe with a slightly different twist. So let's see where the different twists can be. Just by setting the scene to start with, very simple to say one marketing authorization when it comes to the centralized procedures, and quite a huge number of decisions when it comes to the market access. I'm talking about 30 plus. I guess it's more in the area of 50 to 70 if you look at all the regional areas then in the countries. So that's certainly a challenge, and the criteria are different evidential analytical requirements between regulators and HTA bodies. I should also add in between HTA bodies, but let's focus on the difference regulators, HTA for the time being. And if you just recall the slide from Mel, the bubble slide, that was called Can Reach Different Conclusions. He was referring to different valuation of evidence, different approach to manage uncertainties, etc. Yes, I guess there are some differences. But also maybe just a brief reminder of what regulators are focusing on. And that was also mentioned in the talk today. The regulatory decision is based on the benefit-risk decision. It's solely focused on benefit-risk. And to go one step further, legislation says that the decision has to be taken to the exclusion of any other considerations, including economic considerations. So economic considerations cannot be part of any regulatory decision-making process. And I guess that's very important to keep in mind, because that gives a slight different angle, and that is also the cause for some of these differences that we can observe. What we can observe now from the outset is, for centrally approved products, just a couple of examples what you can find in public domain. All of these 4 products here centrally approved, and then it came to the market access later. And I have here 2 quotes in the top left and the bottom right corner from HTA organizations, and the other 2 are basic company decisions based on first feedback. The decision regarding Xiapex for treatment of dipteron contracture was that the comparison to surgical intervention did not lead to the conclusion that the costs were considered reasonable for the product. Therefore, the product is neither eligible for general nor general conditional reimbursement in Denmark. Another example here from the UK, the NICE decision for abatacept not to reimburse as a second-line treatment, so for MTX failures, under the NICE scheme in the NHS. So something again which is not consistent with the approved labeling for the product. Therefore, one has these different decisions, and I guess it's very obvious they're very difficult to communicate to patients. They lead to confusion, obviously, and there's a need for discussion. And I guess this is the discussion we're having now, the discussion of why one comes to these very different outcomes. When it comes to a development strategy and defining a strategy, a basis for what one is generating is, first of all, the project-specific data. So when you define a strategy for meeting a target product profile, it's the product-specific data one is having. One also refers to precedents, so for other products which might have been approved and had gained market access in the same therapeutic area. And the third area are the constraints. I would say those are the 3 pillars everybody would be basing their development strategy to achieve a defined target product profile. And advice and guidelines are key elements in defining such a strategy. And I think it's also important to recognize today that such a strategy has to generate data for regulatory approval and for health technology assessment. I think it's very important to recognize both of those are key for the discussion. So it comes natural that there's a need to have an exchange on evidence requirements. And as you are well aware, regulators have for years now pursued the concept of advice procedures during development. So there is an opportunity for dialogue between regulators and HTA payer groups, not only at time of licensing, but early in the development process through what we call parallel scientific advice for particular projects. And the experience you've seen from the previous speakers, they summarized it already. There were experiences on a national basis, but also on a pan-European basis. And I come to more details in a minute. What are the issues to be discussed? Well, the issue, on the one hand, is certainly also diversity in the HTA approach. And I said in the beginning, it's not just the difference between standards regulators versus HTA, but also amongst HTAs. And I guess a very important point here is to recognize that one thing is in common. It's always the assessment of therapeutic value. This has been taken an overview from a comparative analysis of the role and impact of health technology assessment performed earlier this year. And you can see here for the different countries what is being taken into consideration. And you see clearly that the assessment of therapeutic value is being taken into consideration by all of these bodies for their activities. Therefore, this is certainly an area where one could have most beneficial discussion amongst HTA organizations in a parallel environment, so bringing various HTA organizations around the table. But also, secondly, I think it's an important area where regulators will buy into the discussion, are very interesting to learn and to listen and to participate in the discussion. So this area, focusing on the assessment of therapeutic value, is the area which most people will certainly focus on in this particular exchange. Now, when it comes to the key areas for exchange, of course, we have, on the one hand, we have the pre-authorization requirements, and we have the design elements of the pivotal clinical studies, which are mostly the key of such discussions. Comes it to endpoints and their applicability and usefulness, and the different views expressed by HTAs and regulators, certainly in this field, the comparator discussion that you will be having. And this is a hot topic, of course, and we heard it also in the previous talks. The mixed data model, whether it can be used, yes or no, is something one would like to explore, certainly quite early in the process. The patient population, that can be very differently looked at when it comes to benefit-risk discussion on the one hand, so the regulator's point of view, and the added value discussion from an HTA perspective. So the discussion about patient population can certainly be very interesting and one key point of the discussion. But we should not only focus on pre-authorization requirements, not just getting the initial licensing and later the market access, but also the post-licensing data generation, because that's an important key point. And I guess this is something I would like to add to what has been discussed previously, touch base upon, but I think it's something which is very important to recognize, that there is a need to have further exchange at a quite early stage. What are the objectives of such an early dialogue? We heard it before, the alignment, if possible, regulatory and HTA payer scientific data requirements. So it's not about the evidential standards, it's about the data requirements. So to have a data set generated that can suffice both assessment processes later. Also, of course, to have a discussion about relative efficacy and effectiveness and align post-marketing research activities. The perspective here from a paper which has already been quoted earlier today from our senior medical officer, which brings the current paradigm of a clear distinction between payers and regulators to a potential future discussion where discussions about relative efficacy, effectiveness on the one hand, but also the usefulness and the appropriateness of active comparators might certainly be two key areas where there's much of an overlap, where regulators and HTA organizations would like to have a talk about. Now, we talked a lot about this scientific advice now, parallel scientific advice, not joint. There was one comment earlier, is it joint or is it parallel? It is clearly parallel at this point in time. And I guess that's for good reasons, also looking at the history of how this was developed over the time. And it is a scientific advice process, once it's run here on a European level, which is basically using the existing central scientific advice process, and it's adding another participant at the table, if you will, to make it very simple terms, and have a discussion meeting where this discussion meeting is not just only lasting 1.5 hours, but 4 hours, where there are specific questions addressed to regulators and specific questions addressed to HTA organizations, where there will be a scientific advice letter, as usual, from a central scientific advice process adopted by the CHMP, and where normally oral feedback will be given from HTA organizations. But it's using the model of the central scientific advice process, and this is the way it has been run. You see here the number of 11 so-called tripartite advice procedures so far. Some of them have been run with the Tapestry network, and you have heard about the experience before, and you've seen the various projects. Some of them have been run without the Tapestry network, where the applicant or the sponsor was bringing together the various HTA organizations to come to London for having this parallel scientific advice meeting. Big Pharma so far, you see here an overview of the various therapeutic areas and the member states being involved in these discussions. This is where we are today, and certainly there are more of these processes coming up, more of these processes going on. I guess we can go into some more discussions also later during the panel discussion. Now, if one wants to engage into such a discussion, what can one listen to? What can one learn? Just a couple of examples. Examples for different viewpoints. Let's talk about biomarker development. Hot topic, always. Personalized medicines, we have heard it before. Narrowed patient population. Business impact, I also guess. But then the question about, is there a need to generate data in biomarker negative patients? Well, from a regulatory perspective, the absence of biomarker negative patients will be reflected in the labeling. It's considered in the benefit risk, but it will also be reflected in the labeling that no such data was generated. From a cost effectiveness perspective, data in biomarker negative patients might become very important because there is an additional cost, for example, with the diagnostic tool to be used. Therefore, HTA organizations will look at have a different viewpoint on the need for biomarker negative patient data. And also from an added value perspective, because they will ask themselves, well, if I focus here with a biomarker on a certain patient population, how does this compare to the other alternatives? And is there really an added value? So they will certainly look for biomarker negative patient data to make this judgment on added value. And these are discussions one is having in one room, and one is certainly learning a lot from the other's perspective. Also interesting, of course, comparator identification. The role of the active comparator for benefit risk, well, most of you being regulators, you all know the reflection paper, certainly you do, about the role of active comparator for regulators. Data availability for cost effectiveness. We already talked about the concept of indirect comparison, mixed data models, and HTAs will make their comments about it. And also the cost effectiveness over established generic comparator is something one certainly wants to learn about. So I guess from the pilot experience, it was already explained from a company and network perspective, it was very valuable to have these discussions around the table. I guess also from a regulatory perspective, one can definitely confirm all these discussions were very beneficial, were perceived valuable, and were very interesting. And they were very interesting between regulators and HTA, but I guess also to hear between various HTA organizations what the others think and feel. And what I've heard also from industry colleagues is, well, also industry project teams had very interesting experience when bringing together their internal regulatory and HTA functions to this particular meeting to agree on questions, for example, how to present, how to discuss. So I guess also internally this can be quite an interesting and certainly also challenging learning experience. Now, one particular aspect which I believe is very important is post-authorization efficacy studies. And you're all well aware of the new pharmacovigilance legislation. And I just want to give this idea to you, because I think it belongs to this talk today without going into too many details. You know that there will be particularly guidance being drafted, and this is currently under preparation, where scenarios for post-authorization efficacy studies will be described. And there are many areas like long-term sustained efficacy studies, studies in subpopulation, effectiveness studies, where one could certainly have a look at from a regulatory perspective, but I guess also HTA organizations would be very interested in contributing to such guidance development. And this is something where one should really be watching out for. The consultation, I think it's fair to say, should be in spring next year. And I guess various stakeholders will be contributing to such a guidance. Another area where regulator and HTA organizations are also currently looking into and having a discussion, and I think I want to add this today because we heard about the EPA project, we heard about the advice, we hear about guidelines, but there's also something about post-authorization data generation and NCEP. NCEP, you all know, is a publicly available offers, a publicly available database for resources. On the one hand, an inventory of different study centers and networks, and then also a registry of data resources. And I guess this can be very useful to promote transparency, promote exchange, have a better use of resources. And there have, in fact, already been discussions also with UNETA, as mentioned before, how such data exchange, how such resources could be used mutually. And this is just here a poster which was presented at the EASPRO Congress in November this year by colleagues from the pharmacovigilance sector. So just to give the idea also, post-authorization studies, it's a very key area to have joint discussions at an early stage. Now we're discussing all the time about project-specific development. We're discussing about parallel advice, we're discussing post-authorization studies, but there's one step further which we need to go, and this is the development of guidelines. The development of guidelines being a very important part. And this slide is actually something I showed last year at TOPRA. Last year at TOPRA, the same meeting, I presented about guideline development. It's quite nice to be able to recycle a slide because it's still useful, also in a complete different context. What I wanted to discuss last year was how many different stakeholders are being involved in the generation of a scientific guideline. And in the dark blue, difficult to read, I must admit, bubble, you can see that HTA bodies are an important stakeholder for contribution during the public consultation to the scientific guidances produced by EMA CHMP. So beyond the guidances, it's very beyond the individual advice, it's important to feed into the guideline process in order to have a discussion, reconcile scientific views of regulators and HTA on data generation. And such a consultation could be very much key in this regard. We just started, but it's also fair to say that with UNETA, we're currently exploring how to move this forward, how to have a better exchange on guidances. Just give you some examples. The COPD guideline, which was for public consultation as a revision until end of March last year, did have under the primary endpoints the section patient and investigator reported outcomes. Certainly something where HTA organizations will be very keen on having such data. Just to say that the respiratory drafting group is currently working on finalizing the COPD guideline, and I would expect it to become available in the first half of next year. Another example is rheumatology, where currently the guidance on the development of products for treatment of rheumatoid arthritis is under revision. Here from the concept paper, where some of these aspects are certainly also interesting for HTA organizations to contribute to later in the finalization of such a guidance. And it's talking about some of the endpoints. It's also discussing biologic agents versus active comparators, as active comparators. So there will certainly be something in the guidance which is in its final steps now and should be coming out in the first quarter of next year, the latest. So as a revision for public consultation. So again, there are some areas where mutual contribution might really, really be helpful to generate, and this is always the spirit, to generate a data package that can be appropriate to respond to regulators' questions and HTA questions at the very end. Let me finish by Work Package 5, also already mentioned by one of the previous speakers. UNETA is working on Work Package 5 to develop guidances to further support relative effectiveness assessment. And here are several methodological guidances, so not therapeutic area specific, but methodological guidances under preparation for comparators, for surrogate endpoints, for composite endpoints. And UNETA is currently having a pilot of using their very first draft guidelines internally for having a first experience of what is actually needed, what can be harmonized in terms of standards. I guess this is also something where one should watch out for, because it's again something where guidance will be provided that's going to be important for the later definition of development programs back to the 3 different columns to define a strategy. So let me finish by saying, and first echoing what Mel said at the very end, better integration is key. And I guess that's very fair to say. Better integration is key. Remember his diagram slide that he presented. There's a need for continuous dialogue to generate data in the development program that can support licensing and market access. And such discussion is needed, also considering the different remits, the different standards that might be applied also for certain reasons. And those discussions should be held from a product-specific perspective, but also, and just to add, from a guidance-specific approach. Thanks for your attention.